All right. Welcome to the show, James.
Thank you for having me on.
It's so great to meet you here in person. It's really, really great. You have this wonderful energy that I'm so glad you're involved in this, because you just have a great attitude. And as I told you earlier, my two favorite films, and actually what really got me going and paying attention to this is Out of the Blue and I Know What I Saw. Those two films are great. And now let's talk about what you're doing now and what's coming out.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's always nice to hear that. You know, it's nice to hear when people appreciate the work you're doing, because sometimes you kind of forget that there are others out there supporting you and appreciating your work. And so I always enjoy hearing that. So thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, before I get into the phenomenon, I think I presented this yesterday at the conference, but I always felt that the previous productions, while they're good, and I still stand behind them decades later, they could have been better. I felt that I just didn't quite meet the mark. So I always felt that I could have done better. I didn't meet the mark. When you set out to do a documentary, you kind of have this idea of how it's going to materialize. Like there's a certain vision of what it's going to look like at the end, and I never quite made it with the first couple of films I did. Close, and I was, even though Out of the Blue seems to be more popular online, I felt that although it's held up well over time, I felt that I Know What I Saw was closer to what I was trying to accomplish, but I still fell short. I took notes, mental notes, during those times of rejection for a theatrical release with I Know What I Saw, and I remember thinking to myself in 2009, I'm not going to make this mistake again. But at the end of a long production, it's like the wind's out of your sails. The last thing you can think about is like jumping back into another one. You know what it takes to put these things out, and it's a huge commitment and a tremendous amount of focus and fundraising and work. And so you want to get it right.
How many years would you say? Because I remember it had a different title a number of years ago. 701, was it?
Yes.
And so how many years in production has this been actually?
About 6 years. So anyway, getting back to it, when we decided to move forward with this production, I wanted to set my sights high. I wanted it to look like 60 Minutes. High-level production quality, good camera work, professional audio, lighting. Of course, I do camera and audio and editing myself as well, but to really do it right, you need the pros, and you can't do it all yourself. I mean, and get the kind of results that you're looking for. I wanted the UFOs to be treated like 60 Minutes. I wanted all the interviews to look like 60 Minutes. I want the lighting to look like 60 Minutes. I wanted the audio to sound like 60 Minutes. That's expensive. And I was not going to settle for anything less. And there were periods during the production of this movie where I ran out of money, and I just had to wait until I generated more money, because I wasn't just going to fill the void by doing what I'd done in the past. I wanted to maintain that level of production. So that's what we did with the phenomenon. We also got very fortunate to have the likes of Jacques Vallée as consultants. Thank you, Lee Speigel, for that, by the way. That's really helped us put the pieces of the puzzle together in a way that according to Jacques, has never been done, and I feel the same way. While we're covering some familiar material, we're doing it in a new light, a new angle, new interviews, and with a different twist, with more reality of what was going on behind the scenes.
Did the movie kind of take on a life of its own, like through morphing, or did you have a set plan right from the very beginning?
Oh, they always take a life of their own. I mean, things, when you're in a 6-year production, I mean, we could have never predicted that the front page of the New York Times would have exposed ATIP. I mean, we had no idea that was going on. I was hanging out with Bigelow in 2010 when that was in full swing, right? He'd already gotten the contracts and that was go. He never told me about any of that stuff. Of course not. He's super secretive. Yeah. 2010, 11, 12, I remember I even said to him, I'm laughing right now. I said, whose side are you on? Like, who do you really work for? And he's kind of laughing, excuse me. But it's funny, it's ironic that ATIP came out. So that was another year and a half of production. We went after Harry Reid, we went after Podesta, we went after Fravor and the New York Times, and we wanted to cover that whole story. It was a big deal, and so we did. And since then, even more stuff's been coming out. So even right down to the last minute, I was actually talking to that gentleman who writes for Political, Byron, I think it was. It's Brian Barron or something.
Bender. Brian Bender.
Brian Bender.
It's right out in the hallway, actually. Yeah.
So I was talking to Brian Bender about, possibly getting an interview with one of the congressmen that's been frustrated and feels that the Navy hasn't been totally forthcoming, even though they have made some pretty powerful statements that they're still hiding stuff, potentially. Anyway, so that could be a latest update. So I might actually go to Washington and do that, right down to the last minute, of course. Might as well get the latest, just stuff it in there at the last minute. So yeah, it's constantly evolving and changing and getting better.
How would you want to make a stab at about how many hours you put into this actual film time?
Well, God, I would say the most, well, let's put it this way. For a 10-minute section in Africa, it was the most expensive production I've ever done, and it probably, I want to say, at least 1,000 hours to edit the 10 minutes, at least. I'm dead serious.
God,
yeah.
I would never guess that.
Oh yeah, we went through hundreds of hours of material, and then we had to color code everything and then whittle it down. Basically, several hundred hours, because we had 3 camera interviews and we went to Africa. We had all the archive stuff that Dr. John Mack had done. We had interviews, roundtable interviews. We had interviews with them, sit down, and the witnesses, now adults. We had all the archive stuff, and then we went to Africa and we got all those interviews in Africa, and we had to whittle all of that down to 10 minutes, and we had to get the essence of the entire story in 10 minutes. It was extremely challenging, and I would say easily 1,000 hours, and I had 3 or 4 different guys, myself included, working on it every step of the process. And I have people say, "Oh, I really want to come into the edit studio with you sometime and check out what you're up to," and they come in there like, "Oh Jesus, is this?" If you blink, you've missed about a week's work. I mean, if you tie your shoe, you've missed a month's work. Yeah. I tell people that, I want to pin people's eyes open when they're watching my movie, like, don't miss anything, because this is, I've spent so much time doing this. But
wow, would you be willing to talk about the opening scene?
Sure. I didn't even have funding yet. Just brought this guy on board with the promise of funding, and I was just adamantly wanting to go after Colonel William T. Coleman, who had World War II pilot. He was a public information officer, Project Blue Book, and in 1955 he had this incredibly dramatic encounter with a flying saucer over Alabama with 3 engineers, 2 Allison engines and Lockheed Martin, I believe. And it was a 9-minute long encounter. It got to the point where they were almost going to collide with this thing. I mean, it's a phenomenal story by a very credible observer. Who later, was Project Blue Book spokesman. It's like, anyway. During and I kept telling my funder, I was like, we got to go. He's like, well, we're going to formulate a plan. I said, we got to get this guy on camera. He's 90 years old. We got to go. We can't wait. So there's a couple of people that I just absolutely put my foot down, and he was one of them. And in the middle of the interview, I turned to my camera guy, this guy David West, and I said, Dave, this is going to be the opening scene of the movie. And he's like, yes, it is. And of course, we're going to have to raise the money, and we're going to have to rent the World War II plane, and it was a big deal. Ground crew, people, cameras in the air. I mean, as soon as those propellers start up, that plane is you don't even want to know how expensive it was
per minute.
Yeah,
probably. And tell us about the plane.
Well, it was a 1941 or 42 B-25 bomber, twin engine, and it's the open scene of the whole movie.
Yeah.
It starts off with this really dramatic, I call it kind of like the Bond opening, because it's really cool. You know, you go see a James Bond film and it opens up with this really dramatic chase scene. Yeah. There's no credits or anything. It's just like, you're in it, you know what I mean? And it's like, okay, that got my attention. That was kind of our whole, you know, it's a really exciting, dramatic encounter, but it's also relevant in the bigger picture, you know?
Yeah.
They never were able to explain it. When he became a public spokesman for Project Blue Book, the first thing he did was went to go find out, you know, where his encounter was. Of course, it wasn't there. Could you say it slipped between the cracks? I don't know. But yeah. So anyway, so that's the opening scene of the film.
Yeah. Does he at any time talk about anything really interesting about Project Blue Book that you were unaware of?
Yeah. I mean, he talks about the fact that Project Blue Book, when they closed, made some bogus statements that were inaccurate, and we addressed that in the film. Yeah. And he talks about, you know, they were never able to determine what these things were. I mean, he's like, I don't know what they've done since, but, you know, and I think it's interesting that they were all, it was 1955, Blue Book was in full swing, they were all debriefed independently of one another. Each and every witness, remember, these are engineers and pilots, and they had this dramatic encounter where they thought they were at one point they were going to collide with this thing, and they were at treetop, flying flat out at treetop level in a B-25 in 1955 over Alabama with a disc in front of them that was unrecognizable to all members on board. And at one point he literally said, I thought I was going to hit the thing, and I had to do an evasive action and come up and try to get along the side of it. And then it was just going across this plowed field, and dirt was swirls coming up on the other side of it. It was going across, just looking at this thing going, the hell is this?
Was he actually tracking it? Was he following it?
It was all visual. So they initially, I think they saw it at like 9,000 feet or something, and it came down across their flight path, and then they chased it.
Because he went right to treetops.
Yes.
I mean, that's risky, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was it like to
He said he was
today to do that reenactment?
Yeah, I was talking to a couple of different guys, and I said right off the bat, I said, look, if you guys can't fly treetop level flat out, then we can't do this shoot. He's like, no, I think we could do that. We had to come in over this area, and you know, we only have about 3 passes, because you guys better get this, because you know, we're not supposed to be doing this. We came out of this car. I'm in the nose cone. I'm in the little glass bubble, and we're coming down over these trees, and then it was incredible, man. Wow. I didn't even tell anybody that I was doing it, because I was worried that people were going to, you know, it was a little risky, but it was pretty scary.
Wow.
But it's a really dramatic opening, and I hope people appreciate it. I think they will.
Is the trailer available online at this point, or will it be?
No, it will be soon. Probably, I don't know, maybe a month or so.
Yep.
Something like that.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Can you tell us what kind of places you went to do this film? How many different? You went to China?
Yes.
Africa?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Australia, right?
Yeah. So we wanted to really, excuse me while I have a little water here. We wanted to really, once again, demonstrate the global nature of the phenomenon. And so we went all around the world. I mean, we spent probably the better part of a month in China. I went there twice. I went all across China with a crew. And we went to Australia, spent a month in Australia. I went to Africa. And I remember at the time, I'd done all the interviews and gotten the archive footage of the landing of that case in Rua, Zimbabwe. And then I was like, I need to go to Africa. And my sponsors were like, well, you really need to go to Africa? Like, what do you need to go to Africa? I'm like, it happened in Africa. I got to go, you know. And, of course, it was the best thing I ever did, because I got the teacher on camera and more of the students, and I got to go to the actual site where it happened, you know, and see that. So South America 4 times, and then all across the United States.
Going back to Africa, what was the teacher like in the reaction to the incident?
She was apologetic. She admitted on camera that she had lied, because she was more concerned about her career than she was about what really happened, and that she wanted to apologize to the children.
Wow. But no teachers, as far as
She was a teacher, and she saw it.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Wow. That's a bombshell right there.
Yep.
Yeah, because according to even the students that I've talked to, they didn't think the teacher knew.
Well, the whole community around that area, and even Harare and Rua itself, had witnessed the UFO. It was in the news, and we report on that. And a lot of adults saw the object. The children saw the objects land, but lots of adults saw the UFO, and it was even filmed. 9 seconds at night. It looks just like a little cigar thingy. It's not terribly impressive, but it was footage, and it was on the news, and we have it in the film. So,
wow. So I consider that one of the top cases myself.
Yeah.
Just a fascinating case. Do you want to talk about some of the other cases in particular? Like, I really can't think of any cases in China, but I know there are a lot of them. Just like the big case or whatever.
One of the things that I was impressed with was that, first of all, any UFO organization in China has to be official stamp of approval from the government, and so it's sort of a tacit, yes, we support what you're doing. But I learned about this Meng Jiao case that also happened in 1994, and there were a couple of people that outside of a village that I guess a lot of people in the village saw this thing either landing or landed, and a couple of guys scaled up the mountainside and came in contact with, allegedly, came in contact with the beings, and they had received the same environmental message as the children had received in Africa, and the same year, too.
That's amazing.
I know.
Amazing.
I know. Isn't that crazy?
Wow. That is really something. And in Australia, obviously, the Westall
Yes.
Case, Shane Ryan.
Well, very interesting. Shane Ryan was absolutely instrumental in making all that happen, and James Rigney and a handful of other people in Australia were incredibly supportive and helpful. And we were there, like I said, for about a month, worked on the case for about 3 weeks. I took a little time off up in Port Douglas, but went on some pretty big shows, and we got some good news coverage. And I was on a radio talk show, and I didn't have time to follow up on this. I'm hoping that Shane Ryan followed up on it. But we interviewed witnesses that saw the UFO land. We interviewed a gentleman who took a photograph of what was probably the object 17 kilometers away 2 days earlier. And we got our hands on that photograph for the first time. But there was a guy that called in on the radio that apparently went to the school that got to the trees a bit sooner than these other witnesses, because the object was flying over the school. There was roughly, I think it was 10:30 in the morning, something like that. And there was roughly 365 witnesses all outside watching it, including the teachers. And then the object was just, it would appear here and over here. So some of the students were like, I think there was two. Some of them were like, there was just one. They wasn't sure, but there were 300 plus people outside watching this in broad daylight. Then the object goes off, behind a field and lands. Some of the students jumped the fence and went over to where it landed. Well, the guy phoned in and said that there was a being dressed in white that was outside in the forest, outside of the craft. But we never got to follow up on that. So maybe, big maybe, it might have been a close encounter of the third kind. But the students that I did talk to actually walked up to the craft that was sitting on the ground, got within 12 feet of it. I mean, right there, man. Can you imagine? And talk about a surreal moment. And very, as a researcher and someone who's gone out and interviewed a lot of people for a long time, having someone get that close to a landed flying saucer is pretty rare that you hear those stories. Usually it's like, I think I saw it way off. And then, no, this was right there.
I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit, but why would you think there's so many schoolyard landings? I mean, don't you think that's quite fascinating in itself?
I do. The UFO that was seen in Africa, a lot of times you get these sightings over a week period or several days. There'll be sightings in an area, and then why did it choose to land or make contact with students? And I can only speculate that. But to me, I would say that the most benign presence would be children. If I were to make contact, I would probably make an assessment as to, we military shoots at these things, right? So we're very hostile posture towards anything we can't identify. The children some of the children had told me, and I think I mentioned this yesterday in my talk, there were these wooden poles, like telephone poles almost on their sides that would define the outer perimeter of the playground. And the children weren't allowed to go beyond those poles, because the fields were not mowed and there's deadly snakes and spiders, and so they were, really not supposed to go beyond that point. But they would go right to the edge and they would dance along the tops of these poles. And some of the children had said to me as adults that the beings were mimicking the children playing on the poles. They were sort of dancing along the side like they were mimicking their character. They were just playing, having fun. It was like totally benign encounter. So it's just, that really struck a chord with me, because, children are pretty innocent and harmless, right? And so maybe they made, again, I'm speculating here, but maybe they made that determination that's why they went and landed with the children.
I also think they're impressionable too, and you hear about these, well, and for instance, in the African case, you hear about the possible telepathy that they may have received in taking care of the planet.
Yes.
I think that's a very big message, and one that's actually fits, very well today.
Very, very much so. Yeah, very much so. And it's an interesting message.
Yes. So James, tell everyone about the film. When can we expect to see it? And
I'll say one more quickly thing on since we're on the topic of the message, is that when I met with Senator Harry Reid, one of the things that he said to me was one of the more alarming aspects of the phenomenon that they had uncovered during their investigations with ATIP was they would come over these nuclear-tipped missile sites and disarm our weapons. And Senator Harry Reid said on camera, if the president had called the launch, he couldn't have done it. So I decided to go back, and you talk about the film changing and revisit some of those testimonies. So I contacted Robert Hastings, and he'd done extensive work and he opened up his entire library to me, and we put together a really powerful 10-minute segment dealing with UFOs and nukes in the piece. And launch officer Robert Salas makes a very poignant statement at the end of all this incredible testimony. And he said, "The message to me seems pretty clear. What are you guys doing with nuclear weapons?"
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about when we can expect the movie out?
Yeah, so
Where can we see?
the movie is coming out in the spring. Mm-hmm. There will be trailers and websites dedicated to it. There's a PR company in both New York and Los Angeles that are working on putting together PR for it. We're working on that now, simultaneously wrapping up the film, trying to make it as good as we possibly can, trimming a few things down, tightening up the end a little bit. There's motion graphics and color corrections and sound mixing that still needs to be done. We're working around the clock 7 days a week. But there will be updates and trailers coming out soon this year.
Yeah, that's great. So I understand in the credits, at the very end of the credits, it says, "A film by Lee Speigel" in big letters, in little letters, and James Fox. Is that true?
I think it's going to just say Lee Speigel.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on.
Put me up to that.
Oh, yeah, totally.
All right. Thanks so much.
Of course.
It's been a real pleasure.